In the middle of the Pacific, the Japanese Empire had built what they believed was unstoppable. A fortress so massive, so heavily armed, that no enemy could ever hope to take it. Concrete walls that could shrug off naval bombardments, coastal. Guns capable of annihilating any ship that dared approach. Tens of thousands of soldiers ready to fight to the last man. To the Japanese high command, it was invincible. To the world, it was a symbol of their ultimate power. They called it a fortress. The Americans called it a trap. Every map, every report, every intercepted message told the Japanese the same thing. The Americans were predictable. They would strike head-on. They would die in droves for a few hundred meters of coral and sand. The Japanese waited, smug and confident, believing the empire's power was unchallenged. But the Americans saw something the Japanese could not. They saw a fortress, yes, but also the weaknesses hiding behind its walls. They asked a question no one expected. Why should we attack it at all? What happened next would not just change the course of a single battle, it would change the philosophy of war in the Pacific forever. The U.S. Navy didn't destroy the fortress. They ignored it. They bypassed it entirely, leaving thousands of elite Japanese soldiers stranded, starving, and helpless. What the Japanese thought was invincible became irrelevant, a monument to hubris, while the Americans carved a path straight to victory. For more untold World War II stories like this, make sure to subscribe and tell me, where are you watching from? By 1944, the Japanese Empire had perfected a doctrine of defense built on centuries of martial tradition. They called it the Z Plan, a strategy designed to crush the enemy in decisive, brutal battles. On the outer islands of the Pacific, the Japanese built massive fortresses, Jaluit, Mili, and Wocha. Each island was a fortress unto itself, thick concrete bunkers, massive coastal guns, razor-sharp barbed wire, and machine gun nests. Tens of thousands of soldiers trained to hold their ground at all costs. The Japanese were confident. They had studied American tactics and believed they understood the enemy completely. The Americans are methodical but unimaginative. General Manzo Akiyama told his staff, "They will strike where we are strongest. They will do exactly as we expect. Victory is certain." But the Americans had a secret the Japanese could not anticipate. Cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had cracked Japanese codes, revealing not only the strength of the outer fortresses, but also their glaring weaknesses. Behind the heavily armed islands lay Quadrilina Administrative Hub, the nerve center of the Japanese defense. Out of 5,000 personnel stationed there, only 1,200 were trained combat troops. The rest were clerks, cooks, and construction workers. Admiral Chester Nimitz studied the maps with his closest advisors. "We will not attack the fortresses. We will not attack the fortresses. We'll sail past them and strike where the enemy is weakest." It was a strategy no one had dared attempt, a gamble that could either end the war or end in disaster. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the Pacific had ever seen, a battle where brains would triumph over brute force. And the invincible would be rendered powerless without firing a single shot. The Japanese high command believed victory was assured. On islands like Jaluit, Mili, and Wocha, thousands of soldiers drilled day and night, loading massive coastal guns, reinforcing bunkers, and digging trenches. Every beach, every hilltop, every possible landing site had been prepared for a frontal assault. The outer fortresses were intended to be killing fields, designed to bleed the Americans dry. Admiral Manzo Akiyama walked the perimeter of Jaluit, confident. "The Americans will strike where we are strongest," he said. "Their arrogance is their weakness. They will pay for it with their lives." Engineers checked the guns, soldiers sharpened bayonets, and medics readied triage stations. Japanese believed they were preparing for history's decisive battle, unaware that history was about to be rewritten. Meanwhile, far across the Pacific, American intelligence was quietly dismantling the illusion of Japanese invincibility. Cryptographers had cracked the codes of the Japanese Navy, revealing troop numbers, supply routes, and defensive layouts. Analysts studied the islands with meticulous precision. Every fortress, every gun emplacement, every weak point was mapped in detail. And then, the intelligence revealed something extraordinary. The administrative hub, Kwajalein was astonishingly vulnerable. Minimal defenses, untrained personnel, and no major artillery. It was the heart of Japanese operations, and yet it was exposed, completely. Admiral Chester Nimitz summoned his senior commanders to Pearl Harbor, spread the map across the table, and pointed to Kwajalein. "We are not going to Jalowet," he said. "We are not going to Mili. We are going straight to the center where they are weakest." His admirals stared in disbelief. No one had dared bypass the heavily fortified islands. Yet Nimitz's plan was simple and terrifying in its brilliance. Avoid the trap, strike where the enemy is unprepared, and leave their strongest positions irrelevant. The Americans then began an elaborate deception campaign. Carrier groups launched. Repeated bombardments on the outer fortresses, bombing runways, shelling beaches, and staging mock landings. Japanese observers reported what they believed was the inevitable invasion. They congratulated themselves exactly as they had predicted. Every shell, every feint. Every broadcast was calculated to reinforce the illusion that the Americans were attacking head-on. But behind the curtains, the real plan was forming as the Japanese sharpened their swords for the coming slaughter. The Americans were preparing to sail past the fortress walls. The tension in the Pacific was palpable. Soldiers on both sides braced for the battle they believed would come. But no one yet realized that the true battle would not be fought where the Japanese expected. It would be fought where they were weakest, where their arrogance had left them exposed, and where American strategy would make their greatest assets meaningless. The stage was set. The outer fortresses waited, the Americans readied their fleet, and Kwajalein sat, unsuspecting, at the heart of the Japanese defenses. A storm was coming and it would not be fought the way anyone thought. January 30th, 1944. The Japanese commanders on Kwajalein woke to a horizon they never imagined. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the silhouettes of the greatest armada ever assembled. 7 battleships, 11 aircraft carriers, hundreds of transports carrying 40,000 troops, an entire fleet moving with terrifying precision, and they weren't heading for Jalowet or Mili. They had sailed straight past the outer fortresses, bypassing the concrete monsters that had been prepared to shred them. Admiral Manzo Akiyama watched from his bunker as the first shells fell. The coastal guns he had spent months emplacing, aimed toward the ocean, were useless. The enemy was behind him. "Our doctrine has failed," he scrawled in his diary. "They fight a different war." The bombardment began in earnest. USS New Mexico and USS Mississippi unleashed 14-inch shells that tore through Kwajalelin's buildings, splitting concrete and scattering debris across the administrative hub. Explosions erupted everywhere. Command centers crumbled, supply depots turned to rubble, and communications lines were severed before the Japanese could even react. When the infantry landed, it was chaos for the defenders. Cooks and clerks, armed with rifles but untrained in battle, tried to resist the Americans' assault. Tanks rumbled onto the beaches, flamethrowers spewed fire into bunkers, and waves of soldiers swept through the island. The defenders fought with suicidal bravery, but it was futile. Every attempt to regroup was met with overwhelming force. The Americans didn't just land, they swarmed, hitting Kwajalein from multiple directions simultaneously, leaving no room for counterattack. Within 4 days, the battle was over. Nearly 8,500 Japanese defenders were dead. Kwajalein was in ruins. The Americans had suffered fewer than 400 casualties. It wasn't a battle, it was a surgical demolition. But the true brilliance of the strategy wasn't in the destruction itself. It was what happened to the islands the Americans never touched. Jalowet. Mili and Wocha remained fully manned by elite Japanese troops, ready to die for the emperor. They scanned the horizon daily, waiting for an attack that would never come. The Americans had rendered their fortresses irrelevant. Trapped and cut off, the soldiers faced starvation, isolation, and despair. The Invincible had been bypassed, leaving the enemy's greatest assets as liabilities. The psychological shock was complete. Kwajalelin's fall didn't just cripple. Japanese operations had shattered their philosophy of war. The decisive frontal assault the Z-Plan demanded was irrelevant. Maneuver and intelligence had outmatched brute force. The fortress that was built to be invincible had been ignored and it had failed without firing a single shot, while Quadrilline burned under the precision of the American assault. The outer fortresses Jalouet, Millie, and Woche remained. Fully manned, their soldiers waiting for the attack that never came. Thousands of elite Japanese troops, the pride of the empire, stood behind massive guns and reinforced bunkers, scanning the horizon day after day. Every sunrise brought anticipation, every sunset frustration. They had trained for months, perhaps years, to hold their islands against a frontal assault, and yet the Americans had chosen a different path. From their observation posts, Japanese commanders watched convoys of American ships sailing past their guns. The mighty armada that should have smashed them had bypassed the fortresses entirely. Shells did not fall on their beaches, not tear through their bunkers. The Americans had rendered all of their preparation irrelevant. Confusion set in first, then disbelief, and finally despair. These men, trained to fight, were left with nothing to do but wait and, slowly, starvation. And isolation began to take hold. Admiral Akiyama, Q, now at his secondary command post, could barely comprehend what had happened. His doctrine had demanded a decisive battle, but the Americans had refused to play by his rules. The fortresses that were supposed to grind the enemy into dust now became prisons. Supplies ran low. Communication with the remaining Japanese command was sporadic, unreliable, or non-existent. Morale plummeted. Soldiers realized, too late, that invincibility had been an illusion, and that their greatest strength had become a liability. Meanwhile, American forces consolidated their control of Quadrilline. Engineers repaired airstrips, supply lines were established, and troops prepared for further operations, all while the outer fortresses remained untouched. It was a masterclass in maneuver warfare. Avoid the strong points, strike the weak, and let the enemy destroy themselves through inaction. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese commanders had trained for a battle that would never come. Their troops, elite and disciplined, were left helpless, watching their empire's plans crumble without a fight. The Americans had demonstrated a new type of warfare, one based on intelligence, strategy, and deception rather than brute force. The outer fortresses, symbols of invincibility, now stood as monuments to hubris. Empty threats, unable to influence the course of the war. The message was clear. The American way of war was unlike anything Japan had faced before. Strength would be bypassed, weakness exploited, and the rules of combat rewritten. Those who believed themselves invincible discovered that the true enemy didn't need to destroy them, it simply ignored them. The aftermath of Quadrilline's fall was as striking as the battle itself. The Americans had not only captured the administrative hub of the Japanese Pacific defense, they had rendered the outer fortresses irrelevant. Jalouet, Millie, and Woche remained fully manned by thousands of elite Japanese soldiers, yet their guns, bunkers, and training could not alter the outcome. These men, once feared across the Pacific, were now prisoners of strategy, cut off from food, ammunition, and command. Starvation, isolation, and despair became their only companions. Back on Quadrilline, the Americans set about consolidating their victory. Engineers repaired airstrips, supply depots were established, and fortifications were strengthened, ensuring that the hub could support future operations. Troops moved with precision, striking with surgical efficiency rather than brute force. Casualties were astonishingly low, fewer than 400 dead, while Japanese losses numbered nearly 8,500. It was a lopsided victory, not achieved through sheer firepower, but through intelligence, deception, and audacity. The fall of Quadrilline sent shockwaves through the Japanese high command. The Z plan, which had demanded a decisive head-on confrontation, had been rendered meaningless. The doctrine of attrition, of forcing the enemy to pay with blood for every inch of territory, had failed against an opponent who refused to play by the expected rules. Japan's elite troops were trapped on the outer fortresses, left to wither on the vine, while the Americans advanced with virtually no opposition. This operation became a textbook example of maneuver warfare, and intelligence-driven strategy. Instead of attacking the strongest points, the Americans targeted the enemy's weak heart, striking decisively while leaving the enemy's power untouched but irrelevant. The outer fortresses, once symbols of invincibility, became monuments. Two hubris massive guns pointed at empty seas. Soldiers dying without ever engaging the enemy. Strategically, the consequences were immense. The Japanese command was forced to reevaluate its defensive philosophy, understanding that strong points could be bypassed and that rigid doctrines were liabilities. Meanwhile, the Americans demonstrated the power of intelligence, planning, and psychological warfare. Quadrilline wasn't just a victory, it was proof that brains could triumph over brawn. That strategy could replace sacrifice, that the age of static fortresses was over. The Pacific War would never be fought the same way again. The Americans had not just won a battle, they had rewritten the rules of engagement, leaving Japan's most elite soldiers trapped, demoralized, and powerless. The fortress that had been built to be invincible had failed without firing a single shot, and a new era of maneuver warfare had begun, while the Americans consolidated their hold over Quadrilline. The outer fortresses Jalowit, Mili, and Watches stood, silent sentinels of Japanese pride and hubris. Massive guns, once symbols of invincibility, pointed toward an empty horizon. Soldiers drilled endlessly, waiting for an assault that would never come. Every day, hope waned as no enemy ships approached. The Americans had done the unthinkable. They had ignored the fortresses entirely, turning them into prisons rather than battlegrounds. The Japanese troops were elite, some of the finest warriors in the Pacific theater. But elite training could not replace food, water, or morale. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Messages sent to high command went unanswered or were lost entirely. Daily routines became a grim cycle of hunger, despair, and waiting. Generals paced in their command posts, trying to maintain discipline, while the soldiers began to realize the truth. They had been bypassed, rendered irrelevant by an enemy who refused to fight by the rules. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who had trained to die for the emperor found themselves powerless, their weapons useless, their training meaningless. They watched as American ships sailed past their guns, laughing at the walls meant to protect them. The fortress that was meant to be their greatest weapon had become their greatest prison. Unjallow it. The soldiers tried to simulate combat drills to maintain morale. Mili, men attempted futile raids against imaginary invaders. On Wocha, the command staff debated strategies that could never be executed. Each day brought diminishing hope. Starvation, disease, and exposure slowly began to take their toll. The Americans did not need to attack. The Japanese were already being defeated by strategy alone. From the perspective of the American commanders, a tease was a masterstroke. By ignoring the strong points, the U.S. Navy had neutralized thousands of elite troops without firing a single shell at the outer fortresses. They had transformed the enemy's strength into a liability, leaving men trained to kill, stranded in fortified prisons with no impact on the war. The brilliance of maneuver, warfare, intelligence, and deception had reached its peak. The outer fortresses, once symbols of Japanese dominance, were now monuments to futility. Soldiers starved behind walls that could not save them. Guns aimed at empty seas became silent witnesses to the collapse of Japanese morale. The invincible fortress had fallen not to American firepower, but to the ingenuity, patience, and cunning of a military that refused to fight a predictable war. The fall of Quadrilline and the bypassing of the outer fortresses sent shockwaves through the Japanese command. Across the Pacific, generals who had placed their faith in the Z Plan found themselves forced to rethink everything. The doctrine of the decisive battle of luring the Americans into slaughtering themselves against fortified positions was no longer viable. The Americans had rewritten the rules of engagement. Strength was no longer a guarantee of safety. Weakness had become the true vulnerability. On Jalowit, Mili, and Wocha, Japanese soldiers faced a grim reality. Their guns, painstakingly positioned and maintained, remained silent, aimed at empty waters. Their bunkers, once meant to withstand. Bombardment were now prisons filled with men, starving, waiting, and ultimately powerless. Every day brought dwindling supplies and rising desperation. Communications with the high command were sparse or entirely lost. The soldiers were trapped not by enemy fire, but by the brilliance of a strategy they could not comprehend. Meanwhile, the Americans capitalized on their momentum. Kwajalein became a staging ground for further operations, with airstrips repaired, supply depots established, and troops ready to move on to new objectives. The outer fortresses, though still manned, posed no threat. The enemy's elite forces, trained to be unstoppable, were neutralized without a single direct engagement. Intelligence, maneuver, and psychological warfare had rendered brute force irrelevant. The shock to Japanese morale was total. Soldiers had been trained to fight and die for glory and honor, but now they were powerless. They realized that no matter how prepared, how strong, or how disciplined they were, the Americans had refused to play by the expected rules. Every day, they remained trapped, their invincibility stripped away not by guns or bombs, but by strategy and patience. The Americans demonstrated that war was no longer simply about who could fire the most shells or occupy the strongest positions. War was now about intelligence, deception, and maneuver. The fortress that was meant to be Japan's ultimate weapon had been transformed into its ultimate liability. Kwajalein had fallen. The outer fortresses were irrelevant. The psychological blow to the Japanese high command was devastating. The war they thought they were fighting was over before it had even begun. The Pacific War had entered a new phase. The Americans had shown that weakness could be exploited, strength could be ignored, and the rules of war were theirs to define. The Japanese would never again see invincibility in the same light. The consequences of the Americans' maneuver were immediate and far-reaching. Kwajalein, captured with minimal casualties, became the epicenter of U.S. operations in the region, while the outer fortresses, Jalowet, Mili, and Wache stood, silent and useless. The Japanese soldiers stationed there, once the pride of their empire, were trapped in fortified prisons, unable to influence the war, slowly succumbing to starvation, disease, and despair. The very fortresses that were supposed to intimidate and destroy the enemy had become monuments to futility. For the Japanese high command, the realization was humiliating. The Z Plan, their doctrine of the decisive battle, had been nullified. The Americans had refused to follow the predictable path, bypassing the heavily armed islands and striking at the unprotected heart. The plan they had spent years perfecting, the strategy they believed would force American blood onto coral beaches, had collapsed without a single Japanese gun ever finding its mark. Their philosophy of war, the belief that strength and fortification guaranteed victory, was shattered. American success at Kwajalein was not simply a matter of force. It was intelligence, audacity, and psychological warfare at their finest. By identifying weaknesses, exploiting them, and avoiding unnecessary confrontation, the Americans demonstrated a revolutionary way of fighting. They turned the enemy's greatest assets, their elite troops, and massive fortresses into liabilities, neutralizing them without combat. It was a masterclass in maneuver warfare. The ripple effects were felt across the Pacific. Japanese morale, already shaken by defeats elsewhere, crumbled further. Soldiers trained for heroism now found themselves powerless, watching the enemy seize victories while their own positions remained untested and irrelevant. Across the islands, commanders realized that static fortifications no longer guaranteed dominance. Their philosophy of war, forged over centuries, had been rendered obsolete. The Americans, meanwhile, capitalized on this strategic brilliance. The victory at Kwajalein allowed for rapid advancement, further operations with minimal resistance, and the continued application of the island-hopping strategy that would define the Pacific War. The lesson was clear. Its deception, maneuver could achieve what brute force could not. The fortress that Japan believed invincible had fallen not to guns or bombs, but to strategy, planning, and foresight. The era of static defenses was over. The Americans had rewritten the rules of war in the Pacific, leaving the Japanese Empire to confront a reality they had never anticipated. Invincibility was an illusion. and the true strength lay not in walls or guns, but in cunning adaptability and strategy. The outer fortresses, once symbols of Japanese power, became prisons for their own soldiers. Thousands of men, trained to fight to the death, were left to starve behind walls that no longer mattered. Jalwit, Mili, and Wocha were fully manned, yet utterly powerless. The guns that had been aimed to annihilate the enemy now faced empty seas. A bitter reminder that strength without strategy was meaningless. The fall of Quadriline marked more than a single victory signaled the end of the Japanese philosophy of static fortresses and decisive battles. The Americans had demonstrated a new approach to warfare. Bypass the strong, strike the weak, and let strategy do the work. The Japanese high command was forced to confront a truth that no training, no doctrine, and no heroism could change. The rules of war had shifted. From this campaign, the United States perfected the art of island hopping. Instead of fighting where the enemy expected, they attacked where the enemy was vulnerable, turning pride and preparation into liabilities. The lessons of Quadriline and the ignored fortresses would echo throughout the Pacific, shaping strategies and saving countless American lives in the battles to come. The Japanese fortress that was thought invincible never fired a shot at its true enemy. It failed not because of weapons or numbers, but because the Americans had fought a different war, one defined by intelligence, audacity, and cunning. The invincible fortress was irrelevant. The enemy defeated, and a new era of maneuver warfare had begun. The lesson was clear. In war, predictability is death, and strength without strategy is nothing. The Americans had not just won a battle, they had rewritten the rules of the Pacific War, and in doing so, they showed the world that true power comes not from walls, guns, or manpower, but from the courage to fight smarter than your enemy.